Welcome back everyone. For today's video, I have carefully chosen 40 positions to improve your understanding of chess. First, we're gonna start with piece activity, then we move on to pawn structure, then control and strategy, and at last but not least, tactical considerations. Let's start with this one. Let's start with piece activity. One of the first things you want to do is improve your worst piece. See how effectively you are controlling the board with your pieces. A clue to identify it in many positions is just to look at the first and the second rank. So the second pawn structure, right? In this case, these two pawns are on dark squares, so maybe you cannot really move this bishop, but we can actually move the light square bishop to c2. Once the queen moves, we reroute the bishop into a much better diagonal, and we are hitting a lot of squares. Okay, the next rule to improve your worst piece is where do you put their piece? It all depends on the position, but generally you want to fight for these 4 central squares. Okay, we look at the first rank. We know this bishop is bad. Why don't we just develop and put it here, for example? Yeah, that makes the position worse because if we calculate, this pawn is hanging at the end of this line. So first here they can take with the knight. If we take, they can take our bishop, and now this knight is also hanging. Let's go back. Here, if we put the bishop on e6, we're fighting for one of those central squares, and we're keeping an eye on the pawn. Everything is good. They don't have this threat anymore, and white can play something like f3, but the game goes on. Don't trade a good bishop for a bad knight. How do we know that our bishop is better in any position? The position will be open. Second, we have pawns that we can target. And third, the opponent's knight is restricted. In this case, the position is semi-open. We still have a bunch of pawns here that are blocked. And the pawn is kind of restricted. It doesn't have many moves. So, very important here, we have a target. Important here, we cannot just start moving the bishop because this pawn will move. So first we have to fix this weakness so this pawn doesn't go anywhere. Now the knight moves, we continue the game, we can start targeting this pawn, we grab it, and now we're winning, right? And we can start even targeting other pawns and push the a pawn to promote and get a queen. Same thing here. Who do you think is better, white or black? It looks like it's an equal position. We have 3 versus 2 on this side of the board and 3 versus 2 on the other side of the board. But we have the bishop, right? In an open position, the bishop is going to be better than the knight. So here we can target the pawn directly. This still gives the advantage, but the pawn can move. Okay. Or we can also go for this version where we infiltrate with the rook, and then we're going to start pushing the edge pawn. It's the same idea as before, right? We're going to kick out the knight first, and then we don't let this pawn move. So here's we force the trade of rooks, and then we're going to target this pawn, and they're on a defensive mode. We can never lose this game with white. A good knight versus a bad bishop. So a good knight is going to be better in close positions, and the position is close when it's blocked by many pawns. Second, the bishop doesn't have any targets. Possibly this pawn, but we can just move it easily. And we can get an outpost for the knight. So if you're playing white, where do you put this knight? We can reroute it to g2. And here they kind of have to take. Once we take back, we can get an outpost for the knight. The bishop moves. And now we're targeting these 2 pawns. We can advance the king, actually get rid of this pawn. And the king is going to be out of tempo. We can grab this pawn. And then we are completely winning, grabbing all the pawns and pushing to promote to a queen. Here we also have a close position that is being blocked by many pawns. So first, how do you get an outpost for the knight? We can actually go for this wild ride where we reroute the knight, and then we want to put it on this square, right? Once we get there, we can even trade pieces, but we're going to win the pawn. We win a second pawn, and it's completely winning for white. Or there is a second version where we actually push the pawn. Let me go backwards a little bit. Okay, we push the pawn e5. It's not as clear, right? So we take back, and then we can keep this king out of tempo. Then they have to move the king, we infiltrate, but they're shouldering us, right? Okay, they're going to be out of space sooner or later. We can win this pawn, and this is completely winning for white. You want to avoid bad bishops. So a bad bishop is a bishop that is being blocked by its own pawns. Just look at the pawn structure. All of these pawns are in light squares. That's why we know this is a bad bishop. As opposed to this one that is a dark square, it can travel. There is many squares available for this bishop. We're playing white, so we actually want to take this pawn. They take back. And now the continuation is kind of funny. So we can target this pawn with white. Okay, we can take here. The game goes on. And now they put the bishop on a much better diagonal, targeting all of these squares. So this is a computer move, what you want to do with white, with black. Who do you think is winning in this position? This is black to play, and we can actually play for a draw. This is a positional draw because here the best move in the position is to move the king. We can get rid of the pawn. And now, if this bishop was a dark square bishop, it can kick out the king out of the corner. Or if this was happening on this corner, then the story will be different. However, here we can just repeat moves with black, back and forth, go to the corner and back to the G file, and the bishop cannot give any checks, so this is a positional draw. You might have heard these rooks belong to open and semi-open files, but which rook do you bring into the game, right? In this position it's pretty much the same. The computer thinks this might be slightly better, but if you bring the other rook, it will be kind of the same thing. So here, black has different options. Let's say they take the pawn. Now we can take. And now how do they protect this pawn? Yeah, this is completely lost, and we're winning with white. So even if they don't go for this continuation, let's say they want to double up the rooks, we can even do the same thing here. We can put the rook here on d3, for example. Now, how do they do that? They don't have the space to do it. So they have to move the bishop, we bring the rook, and now we're winning because we have more space and we have double up the rooks. What do you do when the position is open? Or here we're on the open file, the rook is already here. I wouldn't rush to trade rooks. The problem with this is now the rook owns this file, right? We don't want that to happen. What we want to do is bishop to a5. Look for other ways to control the files. And here, if they trade, we take back, and the continuation is really good. They can move the king. Now we can even target the G file with our bishop and our queen, and it's terrible for black. Open versus closed positions. In this case, we have a very open positions. There is no pawn in the middle, and a lot of pieces are facing each other. Here we're targeting the f pawn, and what you want to do is try to make the board a mess when facing stronger opponents. This is my case. I am facing a FIDE master who is very good at positional play, but his tactical abilities are rather dubious. So here I even sacrifice a bunch of pawns, but the game is about equal. In this case, I can bring the knight, target this pawn, and now they have also this problem, right? Okay, they can give a check with the bishop, I can move my king, and now I can even sack the knight. They take, I take, and this is coming, a discovered attack or a discovered check. So yeah, try to make the board a mess when facing more positional opponents. Close positions are going to benefit positional players. I recommend you to be one positional and tactical player. You have to beat both opponents, right? So here, we want to target the white weakness. First, what is the weakness? The backward pawn on d4. And you're going to have to make a slow progress, right? You're not going to win the game in 3 or 4 moves, but we still have a target, the bishop and the knight. And now we can also bring the other knight into the attack. So here you are going to slowly but surely grind down your opponent. Now we want to set up a blockade to stop a pawn break. The pawn break we're stopping is e5, and the best piece to do it is the knight. So here the game continues, and if they go for this trade, then the queen has to move, and yeah, it's terrible for black. Now we cannot just ignore it. For example, a3, then here a3, then they can go for this pawn break, e5. Now the queen is getting in trouble. Even if we go for this trade, we're completely losing one piece. And what if we do it with the bishop? For example, bishop to e5. They have this tempo, and they can even start sacrificing pieces. For example, they can sack the rook. We cannot even take the rook. They're threatening to checkmate. So yeah, always look for a blockade with the knight. With the knowledge we have from the previous example, feel free to pause the video and where would you set up a blockade? So first we trade the bishops. Where do you put the knight now? We want to stop d5, right? So we can reroute it. Once the king moves, we can target the c4 pawn, and we're completely winning. Don't push pawns for no reason. You don't want to overextend your pawns, so 2 or 3 pawn pushes that are facilitating the development of your minor pieces, that's it. So here we can push e4, for example, that's okay, but I have seen players do this. Okay, I'm gonna push the c4 pawn, and then other pawn. What is this? No, just keep it under control, just develop pieces first. I have played this myself, something like e4, okay, Sicilian, and then pushing the pawn. This is considered a mistake. Now black has a target, right? We can get the knight and the queen into the attack. So just to defend this pawn, white has to make a lot of effort. Okay, here we can trade, for example, bishop to f4, and then we can even go for a little bit of a trick, an illusion here. They cannot take because the bishop is hanging. So okay, they develop other piece. Let's assume bishop to e2. We can hit the bishop. We have more initiative, more activity. And just look at the position. Here we have developed the bishop and the queen is out. And it's supposed to be white who has the advantage. So don't push the pawns for no reason. Connected pass pawns are unstoppable, especially when they have crossed into enemy's territory. In this case, if we divide the board into two, and we can get rid of this pawn, then this is going to be a winning game. We can even sacrifice the rook. Here the king takes, and the king is now too far away from the defense, so and the advance of these two pawns. Second brilliancy of the game. We can sacrifice the bishop, and the best move is not to take. It's actually just to move the king, trying to stop the pawns. But okay, let's assume they take. That's a human move. Now we can push the pawns forward. There is nothing you can do to stop them. It's completely winning for white. One pawn can stop two pawns. So in this case, the winning move is to play a5. Here we stop the pawn. They cannot play like this. We just play in passant. Or if they contested like this, b6, we just take the pawn, same story. So after a5, best move in the position, weirdly, is to give up the pawn. Okay, we can just take, and it's winning. And if we go for a slow move, like we don't see a5, we can move the king maybe, king f3, then they go for b5. And how do you stop this pawn? Let's say we take. We're still on time, right? Rule of the square. We can still get into this square. Let's go here and stop the pawn. However, we have lost the position. We have lost the advantage. So we don't want to do that. We can just stop the pawn right away and let black worry about their problems. This one is very simple, but the pawns are going to reveal the direction of the attack, right? So here we have 3 pawns lined up. The attack is going to go this way. We have to get our pieces pretty much on this side of the board, and it's going to be easier to play for us as well. So it takes on d5, the game continues, for example, and now I have my bishops lined up and my rook, all of it attacking this side of the board, if we can divide it into two. One of the weaknesses in chess is going to be the isolated pawn. Not always, it can also become an asset, but in this case we can target the c4 pawn. In many cases it's going to be a d pawn. For example, here we can play bishop to g5, hitting these two pieces. Now it's very difficult to defend for white. Here, even if they bring the rook to the defense, we can waste a tempo with the king. Rook to a4, for example, they also waste a tempo. We can get rid of the knight. And now we push d5. Here they cannot take. This loses the rook. So once they move, let's assume they move the rook. Now we can win the pawn. And we are completely winning. We have 4 versus 3 on this side of the board, plus the pass pawn. It's very difficult to defend for white. You want to target not only the isolated pawn, but the double isolated pawns in this case. So it is very easy to play for black. We can bring in the knight, we bring in the queen, and it's completely winning for black. Isolated pawns can become a weakness, but if isolated passed pawns that have crossed into enemy's territory, it can become a strength, an asset. So here black has to move knight to e5, for example. We can win this pawn. Already with one pawn we can win this game. So queen to c8, rook to b4, for example, bishop to d7. Some of the continuation here, d6, we keep pushing this pawn, and it's completely winning for white. Pieces travel on weak color complex. In this case, the dark squares for black. So we have all of our squares on the dark squares. We want to travel there. And as opposed to white's pawn structure, all of the pawns are in light squares. So in other words, they are not covering any of the dark squares. A move like queen d2, simple idea here. Or queen c1, same idea, doesn't lose the advantage. We can go for this move. Okay, and then black has to give up too much advantage, too much material just to keep the game alive. For example, these are top engine moves. They can go knight to f5, and then have to give up this knight to continue the game, give up another knight. You want to target the backwards pawn if you are playing white, or avoid it if you're playing black. So here, the best move in the position for black, they have to give up this rook, and at least they have some counterplay. But here we can even just take, sorry, if they move something else, we can just take here, and it's completely losing for black. It's too much to bring into this attack. Now we're moving to control and strategy, right? To control the board and control the center. We want to trade your bad piece for your opponent's good pieces. And this is black to play. And this knight is excellent. So if it was white to play, they might get this outpost, for example. But we have black's turn. We can put the bishop on g5, for example, hitting these two pieces. They have to defend. We can even get rid of the knight. And now we can push d5. We're also getting rid of this weakness, right? This was a backwards pawn, but we can get rid of it. And yeah, the game continues. I think this will be a draw with perfect play. 2 rooks on the 7th rank and the 2nd rank can be more valuable than a queen. So in this case, we can even sacrifice the queen and instead take this bishop. They cannot take, so this actually leads to a completely losing position for white. So after this, the queen is forked, and yeah, these are top engine moves. What they actually have to do just to hold this position is completely ignore this queen and give a check here. The queen is still hanging, right? So we cannot move. We have to take this bishop. And yeah, this is going to be a draw with perfect play. So we cannot get out of this windmill of this perpetual. It's not a windmill. This perpetual, so they have to repeat moves. And we are gonna do the same thing here. You want to trade off the powerful bishop the opponent has. So in this case, a common idea is to try to trade this bishop. For example, we can get the bishop out, then the queen out. Once we castle, we go for this trade of bishops, and we should have a slight advantage for white just because we have a slightly better pawn structure. You want to bait the opponent into creating pawn weaknesses. This happened in one of my slow runs. So here I play queen to h5, but there is nothing, objectively nothing in this position. I cannot capture this knight. I cannot even target this pawn, but they do exactly what I wanted them to do. So first they move the pawn. This is an inaccuracy because now they're opening up this diagonal for my bishop. Okay, the game continues. I can move my queen, and now they're getting into trouble. They have to give up the rook, and I don't even have to take here, and it's completely winning for white. Yeah, just go for these moves where you are just baiting the opponent into creating these weaknesses. I'm sorry, here I skip ahead. Okay, queen to h5. Queen to h5 is provoking this. You want to keep the bishop pair and actually have the double bishop advantage. If we can get rid of this bishop, we will be winning. So in this case, we can play knight to c3. We're also hitting the queen, and the best move, according to the computer, they have to take. If they don't take, let's say they move the queen somewhere, queen to b3, bishop to d5, we're hitting the queen, we're trapping it. So yeah, always look for this move. Once they take, now we can take the bishop, And we are much better because we have an open position, beautiful diagonals for our bishop, and open files for our rooks. Whenever possible, get an outpost. So the definition of an outpost. First, if we get the knight here, it's been supported by at least one pawn. It cannot be removed, it cannot be challenged, and it is placed on enemy's territory. Although, sometimes there is exceptions, right? We can have an outpost on this file, it's completely fine. So why wouldn't this be an outpost? For example, rook to d5. It's not a bad move, but it can be challenged by the other rook. So here they can just take. But okay, if they take, let's make a move here. We can get an outpost now for our knight. Now we have an example here of a bishop outpost, but they also have a bishop outpost. How can we say this one is better than this bishop? First thing, this one is closer to the king, right? Although both of them are fighting for central squares. Then this bishop is blocking a rook. So that's very important. And it's also harder to attack. How do you remove this bishop? So the next move, if it was white to play, is just consolidating this bishop, never removing it. One thing to keep in mind is that opposite side castling might make the position worse. Sometimes, not always, but at least you are going to make the position riskier, sharper to play. So keep that in mind. In this position, my opponent goes here, and he has clear plans, right? He's gonna play on this side of the board, and I'm going to play on this side of the board. So after a few moves, the position is gonna get really sharp here. So here I'm pushing pawns here, he's pushing pawns over there, and the game continues. Playing with double pawns can turn into an advantage if we are opening files, especially a file in front of the king. So for example, here we can take back with the queen, that's fine. But what is our plan after this? Instead, we can take with this pawn, and my plan is clear. I'm gonna get my rooks into this file and target this position and target the king. Last but not least, tactical considerations, right? They can also change the nature of the position, and if you can learn 3 types of tactics, forks, spins, and discover attacks, you're gonna improve a lot with only these 3. So in this case, we can sacrifice the rook, or we can take this knight. Once the king takes, we're forking these 2 pieces, winning the piece, and we're winning now with white. I want you to pause the video in this one. What would you play if you're playing black? So in this case, we want to punish the white's queen for being out too early. We can get d5, a discover attack. Here we're hitting the bishop, we're hitting the queen, so it's completely winning. They have to move the queen, we get the bishop, and the game goes on. We can punish opponent's weaknesses after development. So first thing, one of the weaknesses is the king hasn't been castled. So the weakness is this pawn on f7. Second, black just play bishop to g4. This is sometimes, not all the times, but it can be an inaccuracy. It looks like we cannot move this knight. However, we can go for this very active move, a pawn break, e5. e5, they cannot just do this. We can take twice, right? We can take 2 pieces. The best move is actually to take, and now we can sack this bishop. They have to ignore it. But let's say they don't ignore it. They take here. This one comes with check. Okay. And now once the king moves, we're winning the piece. Alright, so yeah, that was the 2 weaknesses they had. The pawn and the bishop. Okay, we can also go for positional sacrifices. This would mean sometimes sacrificing a piece, going for tactics. In this case, it's just going to be a pawn move. What is the most active piece for black? Is this bishop, right? We can also mention maybe this rook is good. The queen is good, sort of, but we're going to go for this positional sacrifice, which is pushing a pawn. But once the bishop takes, we take back with the queen. We leave a space for the knight to come in, and look at this beautiful pawn majority on the queen side with more pawns. In the last example, we removed the bishop, which was very active. In this case, we want to remove the defender of the position, which is this knight, right? There is no other defenders of the king. Why don't we just play queen g5? Yeah, this pawn is hanging. Yeah, we go for a trade here. We lost the advantage. This happened in the game. It's not even the best move, but it still keeps the advantage, sacrificing the rook. And once they take, now we can play queen g5, right? And this is very difficult to defend. Okay, there is something even better than that. So crazy. We can take this pawn. So, well, if they take here, we could just take the knight. We're also removing the defender. But if they take with the queen, which is also really weird, now we can play this move, queen h6. And now, yeah, it's also very, very difficult to defend. Thanks for watching the whole video. In some cases, we can sacrifice a pawn in exchange of a space advantage or initiative. So here we are giving up this pawn. Bishop can take, but we're going to get more advantage controlling more central squares. We can get the queen out, for example. This will be an inaccuracy, but we can take this knight, and now we can take this pawn. It's completely winning for white. So yeah, also keep this in mind. Alright guys, thanks for watching. Please check out my exclusive content for only $1 where we talk about strategy. And I hope you enjoyed this video. I will see you in the next one. Take care.